What's up, my comic comrades? Halloween weekend is already upon us, and what better way to kick off the festivities than to count down our top 10 favorite horror comics. With that said, obviously these sorts of lists are always subjective, so while a lot of you may agree with our list, or at least the majority of it, I'm sure some of you will not. But that's where the comment section comes in. After you see our list, jump in the comments and tell us what yours would be. Tim and I also had a lot of fun talking about our personal favorite Halloween comics and movies in this week's podcast. So be sure to check that out as well after you finish this episode. You can find it right here. But without further ado, let's start our list of top 10 horror comics with number 10. First up, we have 30 Days of Night. 30 Days of Night was created by Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith. This 3-issue horror comic book miniseries published through IDW Publishing in 2002 became so popular, it was made into a live-action film in 2007. So clearly fans were digging the series enough for Hollywood to notice it and make it into a live-action film. But what makes this horror story so compelling is its bleak and unique story. The story focuses around an isolated Alaskan town that is plunged into darkness for a month each year when the sun sinks below the horizon. And just as the last rays of sun fade, the town is attacked by a gang of bloodthirsty vampires. So now only the small town's husband and wife sheriff team stand between surviving and certain death. This awesome concept for a horror story pitting a small town in complete darkness against a gang of vampires with no help in sight is only made that much better with the amazing dark abstract art from comic book icon Ben Templesmith. What I'm saying is, if you haven't read this comic yet and you love horror, you need to, because it's only 3 issues, and if you have a Comixology Unlimited account, you can read it for free with your subscription. Also, watch the movie because it's pretty good too. Next up, we have Witches by Scott Snyder and Jock. This horror series from 2015, in my opinion, is one of the greatest horror comics we've gotten in recent years. This creator-owned series is Scott Snyder and Jock's spin on witches, making them way more horrifying than what we stereotypically know them as. The story follows the Rook family who moved to a remote town in Lynchfield, New Hampshire to escape a haunting trauma. Essentially, they're hoping to start over. But that doesn't go well when something evil is waiting for them in the woods just outside of their new town, watching them from the trees. We find out these ancient things are witches who are hungry. It's a super clever spin on witches and their mythos. It's quite possibly my favorite horror take for witches because, man, it's extremely creepy, and the way he explains what witches are, where they came from, and how they work, it just gives me goosebumps. And Jock's amazing art only makes it that much better. Put it this way, Stephen King, the master of horror himself, said, "It's fabulous, a triumph." Landing at number 8, we have Lock and Key. Lock and Key was created by Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez, and it's become a modern horror classic, recently even getting a live-action Netflix series. Which isn't that shocking because, for those of you who didn't know, writer Joe Hill is actually the son of Stephen King. Joe Hill is short for Joseph Hillstrom King. What makes this series so great is it's like the perfect amalgamation of a bunch of different genres within horror. Like, it has that gothic feel with a mix of Lovecraftian all the way to being like full-on slasher film. But obviously that wouldn't mean anything if it wasn't all wrapped around a great story. The story follows the Locke family to a New England mansion, aka Key House, that possesses supernatural doors that transform anyone who dares to walk through them. Behind these doors is something that will not rest until it forces open the most terrible door of them all. But each door has a specific key, hence Lock and Key, because the family is Locke, and obviously the keys are a big part of the story. Simply put, it's a great story that offers a lot for fans of horror. At number 7, we have Hellblazer, which I'm sure you all assumed was gonna land on this list somewhere. John Constantine and his Hellblazer title is a horror series that deals with magic, demons, and just the all-around dark side of things in our world and beyond. Like the supernatural, the stuff most people can't see. It's a comic book series that follows Constantine as he's taken to hell and back. Literally. He's fought every kind of demon, monster, or entity you can think of. During his Vertigo days as Hellblazer, the title was written by horror comic greats like Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, Warren Ellis, Alan Moore, Garth Ennis, and more. More recently, however, he's now part of the DC Universe, where he's often seen as the leader of Justice League Dark, a Justice League that specializes with taking down the supernatural side of things within the DC Universe. No matter how you slice it, the Hellblazer title and John Constantine in general is one of the most fan-loved horror comic book characters out there. I mean, we've seen him several times in live action and animated form. We're also going to be getting a Justice League Dark live action series on HBO Max soon. He's actually a character that I've been liking a lot more in recent years, so I'm glad he's getting so much spotlight. Now, it doesn't get more horror or Halloween than Dracula, and number 6 on our list is Marvel's iconic Tomb of Dracula series. Now, as Marvel will tell you themselves, and they have because I checked their website, if there's one title that ushered in the Marvel Age of Horror in the early 70s, it was hands down the Tomb of Dracula title, which is the longest running series for those seminal monster classics. The title ran from 1972 to 1979 for a total of 70 issues, which is a feat for a Marvel superhero title, let alone a Marvel horror title. Put it this way, the Tomb of Dracula series isn't just one of Marvel's best horror comics, it's simply one of Marvel's best series. It follows the tales of Marvel's take on Dracula, where Dracula's tomb has been opened and he lives once again. But his descendant Frank Drake joins vampire hunters Rachel Van Helsing and Quincy Harker to return Dracula to his tomb. It's just downright classic 70s horror, whether you're a comic book fan or not. But if you are a comic book fan, it's one of those comic books that when you pick it up and open it, you're instantly teleported back to the Bronze Age of comics. Just pure horror nostalgia. If I haven't sold you on why this series deserves its place on our list, here's a list of some of the creators who worked on the book over its 70-issue run. You have greats like Jerry Conway, Gardner Fox, Steve Gerber, Archie Goodwin, Marv Wolfman, Neil Adams, Rich Buckler, and Gene Colan. Some of comics' most prolific comic creators ever. If that doesn't at least make you curious, I don't know what to tell you. Next up on our list, we have Swamp Thing. He first appeared in House of Secrets issue 92 in July of 1971, and he was created by comic greats Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. Wein and Wrightson did something during their career that not many people do, and that is create one of the most popular, successful, and recognizable comic book characters of all time. Not only did they create one of the most successful comic book characters ever, they created one that was a horror character. You could even say these dudes are responsible for the modern horror comic. I mean, case in point, Bernie Wrightson is credited by most fans as the best horror comic book artist of all time. But anyway, Swamp Thing was elevated even more once the 80s hit and DC turned it over to the hands of writer Alan Moore. At which point, Swamp Thing and horror comics would be changed forever. That's right, before Alan Moore went on to write iconic stories like Watchmen and The Killing Joke, he wrote Swamp Thing. And it's not an exaggeration to say his deconstruction of this classic DC monster stretched the creative boundaries of the medium and became one of the most popular series in the history of comic books. I mean, the series literally gave us all sorts of classic horror, body horror, drugs, sex, and all sorts of other taboos, giving us a truly dark, gritty, mature comic at a time when DC was airing Super Friends on television. What I'm saying is read Swamp Thing, both the Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson stuff, and of course, the Alan Moore stuff. And again, if you have Comixology Unlimited, Alan Moore's saga of the Swamp Thing books 1 through 3 are on there with your subscription. Next up, we have Hellboy. Hellboy first appeared in Dime Press issue 4 in March of 1993. And ever since then, the character has only become more and more popular. I mean, the character has already received 3 live-action films. I don't think any of you need a rundown of who Hellboy is or what his comic is about. We're all pretty much aware by now of what his deal is, unless you've been living under a rock. But if you do want to know more about the character, we broke down his full history in our History of Hellboy episode right here. So all I'm gonna say is that Hellboy is a fantastic concept. Literally a demon who now fights for the forces of good. Given that's not the most original idea we've seen in comics, I mean, Etrigan is basically that as well, but it's the execution on how Mignola created Hellboy that makes him stand out so much. He's this sarcastic, cigar-smoking, beer-drinking, witty badass demon who ends up working for BPRD, which stands for Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense. And on top of that, the rich, cool, and unique backstory Mignola gave Hellboy and this universe pushes it over the top and made it a fan favorite. His series follows him fighting the paranormal alongside several allies. If you've seen any of the Hellboy movies, you know most of this already. But it's actually that much better in the comics, so definitely check out the Hellboy comics if you haven't already. Number 3 is another horror comic you knew was gonna be on this list, as essentially the whole world is familiar with this franchise already, and that of course would be The Walking Dead. Created in 2003 by Robert Kirkman and Tony Moore, this horror comic series has gone on to become quite possibly the biggest or most successful horror comic series of all time, mainly due to the extremely popular Walking Dead television series. Obviously the TV series has died down in recent years, but those first 4 to 5 seasons were a phenomenon. And it all started as a creator-owned comic book. Now I don't have to break down this series to let you guys know what the Walking Dead universe is all about, because I think it's safe to say that everyone's grandmother even knows what The Walking Dead is about. So I'm basically here to say that if you like the TV show, the comic book series is that much better, which says a lot because again, the first 4 to 5 seasons of the TV series was freaking great. The Walking Dead comic series is responsible for the resurgence of zombies. One could even say the comic is as important to zombies as the Night of the Dead film. It put zombies in the limelight again in a massive way because the storytelling by Kirkman was phenomenal. It's just such a great human story with people just figuring out how to survive against things that want to eat them. They're just stories where you could put yourself in the character's shoes and be like, what would I do in this situation? Which I think is the biggest reason why people gravitated towards it so much. Anyway, The Walking Dead is a great horror comic. Everyone's heard of it, so read it. Now for these last two, we're gonna bring it back old school to the kind of horror comics that started it all back in the 50s and 60s. So landing at number 2, we have Creepy Eerie magazine or comics. Now back in the 60s, when Creepy and Eerie magazine was coming out, this was the stuff that as a kid, you always wanted to read, but you knew your parents wouldn't let you. So you would somehow sneak a copy in your house and read them under your bed sheets with a flashlight when your parents were sleeping. What also made this comic stand out from others is that it was black and white like horror films of its day. And it's probably the reason why modern horror comics like The Walking Dead chose to be black and white, because it harkens back to something classic and nostalgic within the genre. But no matter how you slice it, this is one of those few books that paved the way for horror comics today. It's kind of the equivalent of watching those old Universal monster movies in comic book form. Just listen to a solicit for the comic and tell me it doesn't give you all those classic horror nostalgic feels. Gather up your wooden stakes, your blood-covered hatchets, and all the skeletons in the dark depths of your closet, and prepare for a horrifying adventure into the dark corners of comics history. Come on, that's just some classic old school horror. But even though the series was really dark, it did have some humor to it, which I think only added to the brilliance. But with that said, let's move on to our number 1 pick, The Big Mama. And number 1 on our list is also the oldest comic book on our list, the granddaddy of them all, Tales from the Crypt. Like some of the other comics on our list, Tales from the Crypt would give us a series of one-shots or one-off stories that were seriously horrific tales that gave people nightmares, especially for the 50s. We're desensitized today, you know, seeing all kinds of stuff in comics, TVs, video games, and movies, but you have to understand, back then the stuff the Tales from the Crypt were showing was not commonplace at all. The stories told within the comic were usually tales of revenge or caution, as the comic would show us a character getting revenge or doing something that ultimately ended in a horrific and sometimes ironic fate. What's funny is that a lot of people don't realize that the Tales from the Crypt comic actually served as the story structure and overall influence for TV shows like The Twilight Zone, which you can blatantly see when reading a Tales from the Crypt comic and then watching episodes from The Twilight Zone. The story structure is nearly identical. What also made this comic series fun is that each story was introduced by a horror host. There was 3 different ones, the most popular being the Crypt Keeper, but then you also had the Vault Keeper and the Old Witch. They would introduce and set up each story, which again, years later, a lot of shows would do the same thing, having a host set up a horror story that you were about to watch, like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Twilight Zone, and even Are You Afraid of the Dark? What I'm saying is, I don't think any comic fan can argue that Tales from the Crypt is responsible for laying the foundation of the horror comics we have today. Heck, the show even got a live-action HBO series decades later, which my dad loved, and as a kid, I would always try to sneak a peek while he was watching it, and when I did, it ended up terrifying me. But the horror gods shined upon me and were like, fret not, young Arris, we have something just for you. And years later, they came out with Tales from the Crypt Keeper, the animated series, which was dope. You guys remember that series in the 90s? That was my jam. Anyway, there you have it, our list of the top 10 horror comics you should read for Halloween. But before we wrap up, we want to give you some honorable mentions, which are Gideon Falls, Afterlife with Archie, From Hell, and Ice Cream Man. Altogether, you now have a great list of options to choose from. But again, let us know what some of your favorite horror comics are in the comment section below. And that's gonna bring today's episode of Variant to a close. But if you enjoyed today's video, check out this one right here. And if you like all of our content, as I always say, subscribe, like, and comment. It always helps the channel out. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time when I talk about what? All things comics.